Hello and welcome. Assalamu alaikum. This is our 18th installment in the CIGA Ramadan web series. Today, we are very excited to have Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool with us. He'll be speaking on the topic of justice, the foundation for dignity, and the precondition for human development. I will begin by introducing Ambassador Rasool, and then we will have a roughly 45-minute presentation by him on the topic given, and I will then take question and answers via the live event. For all of those who are participating, please post your questions in the question section, and I will channel those questions to him via the live link. We'll try to aim to end a little bit before 5 p.m. Istanbul time. Ambassador Rasool is, as is well known, a South African activist, politician, and diplomat. He served as the South African ambassador to the United States from 2010 to 2014. Prior to that, he held numerous positions in South Africa, such as the Member of Parliament. He was the special advisor to the president and to the governor of the West Cape province. He has built up an extensive experience in government. He has led a number of portfolios, such as the Health, Welfare, and Finance and Economic Development portfolio. Currently, he is the CEO of the World for All Foundation. Ibrahim Rasool is remembered for his involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle, and he has had leadership positions in the Islamic movement and the interfaith movement in South Africa. Through his writings, lectures, and speaking engagements, he has been instrumental in mobilizing Muslims and the broader faith communities towards a deeper understanding of Islam and faith under conditions of oppression, such as apartheid, and currently under conditions of globalizations. Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, the floor is yours.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and to you, Uwais, everyone at CIGA, and all those who are participating, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, and good afternoon in South African time. I want to say that today on the South African Muslim calendar, it is the 17th of Ramadan. The 17th of Ramadan is that period, or that day in which the Battle of Badr, 2 years after Hijrah, occurred. It is seen as a turning point in Islamic history, as a breakthrough for the emergent Muslim community, but also a signal that an interregnum, a transitional moment in history for those early Muslims, that interregnum had ended. They were making the transition at that moment from being under siege to a community that could now reach out, from consolidation of the community to expansion, from preservation under enormous conditions of challenge to progress. And therefore today, on this particular day, with the topic of justice, human dignity, human development, it is worthwhile to ask ourselves the question, what is the state of the Ummah today, of the global Muslim community today? We've got to examine the state of the Ummah. We've got to understand the depth of the crisis that we're in. We must evaluate the prospects for revival. We must assess the extent of the injustice that we experience and the need for justice that we have, the deprivation of dignity, the shallowness of our human development that the Ummah and the global Muslim community, together with many others in the world, experienced. And we've got to compare and contrast with that initial interregnum that I signaled with the Battle of Badr, and see whether there are lessons to be learned out of how that interregnum was managed, although the context is different today, and whether the model that we see there is upgradable for us to be able to learn these lessons. The question at this moment in time is, can COVID-19, the coronavirus, the dystopian landscape that it had sketched for us, the lockdown that we're in, the threat to our life and livelihoods, can this represent a turning point for the Muslim community? Could it signal for us the beginning of our revival as we go forward? Looking at the state of the Ummah, I want to say that in the heartlands of Islam, where we are majorities, the Middle East, the North African region, where we originated from, the situation there is that we live under conditions of occupation. Palestine is most notable. Aggression and oppression, many of our countries experience that. Authoritarianism and despotism, that's the governing form that we sit with. Terror is certainly a reality, particularly through various iterations from Al-Qaeda to Daesh, etc., and exclusion of women and even the Muslim other in some of these heartlands. Whereas on the periphery, we are having a situation where the Ummah or the Muslim community will live in conditions of minority, face the challenges of discrimination in general, where they are black, like African American Muslims, where they are Muslim, they face Islamophobia, but generally it's defined by suspicion, stereotypes, and a range of different discriminations. There are, of course, in this significant exceptions where majority countries do not have authoritarianism, for example, and there are societies where Muslims are not subjected to things like Islamophobia on the same scale. But what is more alarming, that punctuates this injustice that we are facing, is that the organization of the Islamic communities, about 54 countries in all, on the one hand, have 31% of the global population, roughly about 1.6, 1.7 billion. On that same one hand, we produce 70% of the world's energy needs and supplies, and 40% of the world's raw materials are in the countries of the OIC. Yet, on the other hand, less than 10% of global trade is managed by those Muslim countries, largely because we are simply exporting raw materials. And we're exporting raw materials because our literacy levels are only 74%, whereas non-OIC developing countries have 80%, 87% literacy levels. And ours is gender coded because we are pulled down because it's mostly women who are denied literacy. In scientific publications, the OIC in 2015, the OIC countries produced 140,000 books or articles in scientific publications, whereas China alone had doubled that figure of 280,000 scientific publications. In terms of inventiveness, judged by patent levels, patent registrations, the OIC countries have only registered 1.7% of 2.6 million patent applications in the world. And therefore, what we can be understanding out of this is the low level of human development, scientific development, the high levels of repression and discrimination, and therefore the great need for justice to redefine the ummah in these times. I will go further and posit that over the last 70 years or so, the Muslim community globally have been in the eye of the storm, particularly in our heartlands. I would go so far as to say that about 65 to 70% of global conflicts involve Muslims, either by virtue of what Muslims did or by virtue of what was done unto Muslims. The original sin in this last 70 years has been the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, leading to Arab-Israeli wars, Palestinian struggles, intifadas, the incursions into Lebanon, etc., etc. India's independence around that same period led to the partitions, particularly bloody, first with Pakistan and then with Bangladesh, the persistent cancer of Kashmir, and today the contemporary challenge of dealing with the Hindutva. Iran in 1953, the coup d'etat that overthrew the democratically elected President Mossadegh, leading up to the 1979 revolution, continuing into the tensions today. The struggle for independence from the 1950s, Algeria, Indonesia, countries in the MENA region, the Middle East, North Africa, etc., have all exacted a major toll on the Ummah. Afghanistan, the British colonization, the USSR, the Soviet incursion, the Taliban installation, the two conflicts with the United States and the West have left permanent scars on the Ummah. I can say exactly the same thing with Iraq. The Central Asian republics post-USSR have been born in bloody ways. 9/11, the attack on the Twin Towers in New York, the resultant war on terror, the reprisals in London, Madrid, Kenya, Boston, etc., etc. The Arab Spring that brought so much hope, and then the counter-revolutions brought so much despair. Those have all punctuated the existence of the Ummah and defined the state of this Ummah that we are in today. On the other hand, Muslim minorities may not have always been in the eye of the storm, but they have certainly suffered the Hamlet syndrome. Do they belong where they are in the West or in minority situations, or don't they? Do they join or don't they? Are they citizens or are they not? And today it is true that 90% of the countries of the world have significant minorities of at least 10%, not all Muslim, but significant minorities, meaning that the monocultural, the unicultural trends that have existed in these countries for centuries have been disturbed and disrupted, because now they have significant minorities of other cultures, other religions, other languages, other cuisines, other ways, other traditions that they need to be dealing with. On the other hand, today 25% of the global Muslim community live under conditions of numerical minority. Some have assimilated and forfeited their identity in order to become the same as their host countries. Others have isolated in an attempt to remain where they are, not only as Muslims, but as linguistic communities, cultural communities, and even tribal communities, in some places even like Birmingham. And others have started a movement to integrate, where they have been able to retain their integrity and at the same time adopt an allegiance to the integrity of the nations that they are in. But all of these challenges, all of them face challenges like migration policies, a variety of bigotries, most notably Islamophobia, rising populisms in the country where they are, whether in Europe, whether in the North America, or whether in Southern America. We have seen these rising populisms on the basis of the existence of Muslims. We have seen counter movements of extremism in the name of Islam and Muslims. We are currently going through the two largest minorities in China and in India, facing their own almost pogrom-like attacks, the Uyghurs as well as the challenge of Hindutva. This tells us that the imperative and the need to bring calm to the Muslim soul, to bring justice to the Muslim community, has to be the precondition for bringing calm, peace, and justice to the world. Or unless we have justice for the Ummah, there is very little chance for global peace. And therefore, it cannot simply be justice as a legal entity. It has to incorporate the very essence of dignity. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have given the children of Adam their essential karama, their essential dignity and honor. And it has to be based on development. If justice is the precondition, then the key ingredients of what needs to happen is the existence of dignity and development, and the outcome has to be a sustainable peace. And the question again is, does the current moment offer us this opportunity to move decisively towards that kind of condition and those kind of outcomes? The idea of an interregnum, this pause in history, this transitional moment in history, this moment in which you can try to reposition, to reinvent, to reimagine yourself, to reconstitute yourself. We need to understand that that notion of an interregnum is the one that I started with invoking the Battle of Badr. It's part of the prophetic tradition within Islam itself. 7 years before the Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ gets revelation, غُلِبَتِ الرُّومِ, Rome has been defeated. And the Quran goes on to say, this will soon end, Rome will soon be victorious again. Therefore beginning to set out the parameters of this interregnum, from that moment of defeat to the moment of victory for Rome. This is the interregnum, this is the time you have at your disposal. And the Quran promises that soon the believers will be happy again, holding out the promise that the end of this interregnum will be better than the content of the interregnum itself. فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْأُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّ مَعَ الْأُسْرِ يُسْرًا. Out of difficulty comes ease. Immediately, the early Muslims start to prepare themselves in order to manage what has to happen in this interregnum. And it is absolutely strategic. And we've got to learn these lessons if our struggles for justice, for human dignity, for human development, and for peace is going to bear fruit. The first thing the Muslims do is to absorb punishment. They invoke strategic patience in Makkah. They survive 2 years of boycotts, the torture of Sayyidina Bilal, the martyrdom of Sayyidina Sumayyah, the insults and the ridiculing of the Prophet ﷺ, the bankrupting of of Abu Bakr. May Allah be pleased with all of them. They absorb that punishment and begin to plan how to emerge from this interregnum. That's the first thing, a strategic patience. They move from there to take out a strategic insurance just in case things go wrong. The Prophet ﷺ sends Ja'far and a group of early Muslims to Abyssinia in order to seek the protection of the Negus and to preserve themselves. That's a strategic insurance. From the strategic insurance, they move to examine the possibilities for strategic alliances. The Prophet ﷺ reaches out to Taif, gets rebuffed. And then Aus and Khazraj of the then Yathrib, later Medina, they approach him, and immediately the basis is set for a coalition that will become an alliance. And once they have that in their pocket, they are able to move from the strategic alliance and prepare for what is the strategic retreat, the Hijrah. And it is then that they make the move from Makkah to Medina. And as soon as they arrive in Medina, they start the process of a strategic consolidation. The Charter of Medina unites the Muslims with the Ahlul Kitab, and unites that whole community with even the hypocrites and the polytheists, in order that they may achieve the greater objectives that they have in mind. It is 2 years after the Hijrah that Rome defeats Persia again. And in that same year, Quraysh sends an army to break down and to defeat this emerging community. At Badr, the Quraysh are defeated. It's very, very clear that for us, justice even as a precondition, if you look at that interregnum, how do we absorb the punishment that we are enduring currently? How do we create cohesion and solidarity and alliances and all of those kind of things in order for us to emerge from our current interregnum? How do we collapse the intra-Muslim fault lines in the same way that the Prophet ﷺ was able to collapse the fault lines that he encountered in Medina, the fault lines of Shia Sunni, of Islamist secular, of extremist moderate, of Islamist extremist, of Wahhabi Sufi, etc., etc. We carry with us the luxury of not only indulging those fault lines, but deepening them on all kinds of bases, some spurious and some well-founded, but all of them stopping the Ummah from remaking itself in the best possible way. So we need an internal consolidation that requires sifting and uniting. But we also need an external outreach that creates partnerships, coalitions, and alliances, an inter-community or inter-civilizational approach in which we don't hold ourselves up as the only victims of oppression, the only victims of bigotry, the only victims of poverty, but that we recognize all of those in our contemporary global community in order that we may make a human effort for justice and not solely an ummah effort for justice. And therefore, we've got to collapse those kind of barriers that we have set up between ourselves and other Muslims and between ourselves and other communities. The Muslim struggle for justice, particularly in our heartlands, presents us with a triangular conundrum. If you could picture a triangle, you would see at the apex, at the top part of that triangle, you would see the absolute necessity for relieving the restless. But had it simply been a case of bringing justice for the poor, for the downtrodden, for the oppressed, for the repressed, then it may be easy. We have at the base of those triangles, of that triangle, we also have to manage the unsustainable. In some cases, eliminate the unsustainable. Those are the old forms of governance, the authoritarian forms, the dictatorial forms, the single-party states, the monarchs who rule by diktat. How do we manage the unsustainable? Because it can't last forever. The only thing holding them up is often the surveillance and repressive state. But at the same time, in trying to bring relief to the restless and to manage the unsustainable, we at the same time have to ensure that there is no room for the undesirable. Because waiting in the wings is an alternative form of injustice based on extremism. And so, in relieving the restless, we've got to deal with the triple challenge of dispossession that leads to poverty and inequality, discrimination, as well as repression. How do we free people up from those conditions under which so many of the Muslim masses live together with fellow citizens across the world? How do we deal with the one base of the triangle, the authoritarianism, the rising populisms, the Western co-options that have taken place and dominations that continue to take place in large parts of the Muslim existence? And how do we deal with the other angle of the base, the undesirable extremism? How do we ensure that we are able to fight on multiple fronts in search for justice? Otherwise, justice remains an imperfect equation for all of us. Linking to the point that I had made earlier about the need to reach out as well and to reach in. In reaching in intra-Muslim and reaching out inter-community, we must take the example for justice that is also presented by the prophetic tradition in terms of the Khilful Fudul, the coalition for virtue. And Muslims find this very hard because we have so many preconditions for who we work with. I remember, for example, speaking on a platform about the South African political struggle with the leader, the deputy leader of the Dalits in India, the untouchables in India. And she admitted that the community was affected by poverty and alienation and marginalization in India than even the Dalits were the Muslims. But she said, if only you are able to lift your eyes above what you see as our idols, imagine the powerful movement for justice in India that could come between the Dalits and the Muslims. And that told me the story that our inability to reach in for cohesion and out for a common front is one of the biggest barriers to our ability to prosecute a struggle for justice. Not all relationships with others are marriages. When you share issues with people, you form partnerships. In South Africa, we did not like many of the white apparatchiks of apartheid. But they too didn't want their children to go to the army, and so we incorporated them in the end conscription campaign. In Muslim minority countries, we often wonder, what do we do with the Jews with whom we have a strategic misalignment and a strategic struggle against Zionism? What do we do in America when they face anti-Semitism and we face Islamophobia? What do we do in the majority Muslim countries? Are all the military personnel the same, or are we able to find issues on which to work together? So that's what the partnership is for justice. A coalition for justice is when you share objectives. So you may not share a vision, you may not share values and principles and ideologies, but you share an objective. In our case, we shared no vision with your kind of liberals, for example, or your kind of Afrikaner nationalists, for example. but we shared an objective with some of them to defeat apartheid. And so we formed the United Democratic Front to incorporate all of those elements that could be a vehicle for justice. In minority countries, how do we have similar objectives with people who want to defeat populism, whether it is Trump's populism or Brexit's populism? What does this mean for coalitions that include the LGBT, Black Lives Matter, etc., etc.? And in Muslim majority countries, what does it mean for coalitions with secularists and communists? They may not all be delivering the same kind of justice, but they may be helping to establish the basis for justice. And where we share values with people, principles, and visions with people, that's where you form alliances. And so in South Africa, the interfaith alliances were absolutely crucial because we strove for values like justice and peace and equality, etc. The same with faith communities and the left in minority countries, and sometimes even the same with our relationship with orthodoxies. The ulama may not always be on our side. Some of them may be beyond the pale, but we may share enough values with them in order to move forward. But these are only possible if there is a sense of strategy. The Muslim community has a definite deficit of strategy. We are often high on principle and very cunning on tactics, but there's no connective tissue that is called strategy. When those two are disconnected, principle and tactics, the one can lead you down the path of extremism, the other one can isolate you and make you an ineffective part holding high principles without action. It is strategy that connects it. And therefore we've got to restore that missing middle for the Muslim community if justice is going to become a reality. Otherwise we will have outrage without a plan. Otherwise we will have visions without a plan. And therefore we've got to be able to do it, because in the absence of that, we don't have our eyes on the prize. We don't have a vision that governs how we move forward. And so, for example, I have read Surah Al-Fath, the victory. And for me, that is the clearest condensation of the art of war, where the Prophet ﷺ had choices at Hudaybiyah without going into the entire history of what happened there. You can read that. But the first choice he faced was whether to push through with the Umrah that they had set out to do. Their niyas had been made, their hair had been shaved, the sacrifices had been brought along, and they were on their way to perform the Umrah when they were stopped. When they were stopped, his choice was the Umrah of winning Makkah eventually. He forwent, or he gave up on ritual in order to achieve strategic objective. How many of us would be distracted at that moment, as Sayyidina Umar, may Allah be pleased with him, was almost distracted? His second choice was, do you win the battle or do you win the peace? Because everything he conceded to appeared to be ultra peaceful and ultra compromising. In other words, did he choose an immediate victory or a long-term victory, a strategic victory? The third choice he faced was, do you defeat the enemy that you see, or do you defeat the paradigm, the ideology, the worldview that emanates from idolatry? And again, his choice was what was visible versus the vision, fulfilling the vision. And it is instructive that Surah Al-Fath ends with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling the Muslims, we have fulfilled your vision for you. Now that is absolutely important for us to understand the art of war that is germane to the Quran. And the question we must ask is, does this moment in history, this COVID-19 moment, how important is it for us to begin to think in terms of this moment in history being an interregnum, this moment in history being a possible point of transition, this moment in history being an opportunity for us to reinvent, reimagine ourselves as an ummah, because COVID-19 has decreased loyalty to populism. It may not mean the defeat of a Trump, but victory is waiting if we can think strategically. It may have decreased the strength of authoritarian regimes because suddenly the oil price isn't what it used to be. And even Saudi Arabia has to add new taxes in order to give it money. The absence of tourism revenue because of the curtailment of the Umrah and the insecurity about the Hajj may mean that the coffers are not as full to drive extremist programs or to maintain repressive regimes, even though the technology for surveillance has increased. On the other hand, the increasing grievance amongst the Muslim masses and masses across the world is such that there is massive food insecurity, massive increased poverty, growing inequality, bonds can't be paid, and so houses would be repossessed. And suddenly, the ground for discontent has grown. People become aware of the injustices, otherwise they simply coexist with the injustice. The question is this moment pregnant with opportunity? My answer is not necessarily, because nothing is automatic. People will have what they strive for. And therefore, there is no automatic deliverance for the Ummah. We've got to conduct a struggle for justice. If you look at the example of Nelson Mandela, his struggle for justice started particularly when he was in prison and he struggled within. He struggled to cleanse himself of ambition, of his preconceptions about communism, his preconceptions about whites, and de-racifying himself in a sense. His struggle against a sense of victimhood and to transform himself into an agent of change. And so, unless we are able to do that, as a starting point, we are not going to be able to drive the struggle for justice, because we may be struggling for other things, but not necessarily justice. Nelson Mandela then had to define his values. In the dock, when he faced the death penalty, he made his statement that started by saying, "I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society with equal opportunities, justice, equality for all, etc. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." Now, Nelson Mandela was not invoking the extremist mantra of plunging yourself to death, suicide bombing yourself to death. No, he was understanding that there are something so precious, so valuable, so worthwhile, that they must be lived, that if necessary, you must die for them, but more importantly, you must live for their achievement. That's the difference between a mainstream struggle for justice, you want to achieve things, versus an extremist struggle in which no life is valuable, not even your own. Thirdly, that taught Nelson Mandela the difference between a uniting framework and a dogmatic framework. And so the ANC, the African National Congress, didn't gore the world, didn't exhaust the world with detail. We held up, even for South Africans, that we stand for a united, non-racial, non-sexist, democratic and free South Africa. 5 values. We didn't go into how the land will be divided, who will be the government, how will we form the government, who will write the constitution. And that's why we were able to build a massive movement of South African citizens for liberation, and an even bigger movement globally, the anti-apartheid, the Free South Africa movement. And we have to clarify what it is that we stand for, because so many of us have the sense of victimhood, the sense of outrage that we are unable to articulate what we say. We are so emotional and sometimes extreme in what we say that we make people afraid to either join us in the countries where we are or to be in solidarity with us from outside our country. The next and 5th thing that I think illustrates the way in which Mandela led a struggle for justice is to understand courage in a wise way, almost a kind of Kantian way, in which the opposite of cowardice is not courage. The opposite of cowardice is recklessness. Because the cowards hide from the truth, hide from action, hide from doing anything. The reckless are reckless with lives, are reckless with the future, are reckless with their ideals. The perfect middle is courage. When you have the courage to fight and you have the courage to oppose those who are reckless. It avoids the fear of the coward, but also the bravado of the reckless. And therefore, Nelson Mandela could be, at the same time, simultaneously, the founder of the ANC's guerrilla army, but no one would call him a warmonger, because no one ever doubted that he loved life and cherished life itself. But he was also the chief architect of our peace negotiations, but no one would call him a pacifist, because they all know that he knew that there were things worth struggling for. He never stood back from a struggle for justice. And justice is not an end in itself. It sets up an interregnum and a transition in which for a long period the old and the new may coexist. And sometimes you've got to give birth to the new, even while you are being pulled down by the old. In the heart of authoritarianism, you've got to do human development, teaching people, literacy classes, feeding the poor, setting up alternative forms of government, etc., etc. And finally, we've got to embody the values that we purport to envision. We've got to, if we stand for peace, we can't be wantonly violent. The ends do not justify the means. If we stand for simplicity, we cannot live opulent lives. If we stand for justice, we can't oppress our wives. If we stand against autocracy, we are consultative in our business. You see, unless your embodiment of justice does not precede you, your promise of justice will not be believed. I thought, inshallah, that it may be useful to share these with you in order to help shape how we conceive of the struggle for justice, in order for us to be able to start the preparation for justice, even while injustice is at its height. In order for us to be able to grab this moment that could be offered by the COVID-19 pandemic, when the world is disrupted, when the certainty gives way to uncertainty, where the difficult gives way to complexity. This is the time when we should be uppermost. This is the time to start the plans. This is the time to make sure that inshallah we will emerge with justice, that justice will lead us to pursuing human development and human dignity, and that the end result, the outcome of all of this is a sustainable peace. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rasul, for your insight and wise words. You have given us a lot to think about, and your statements were pretty provocative. They make us think about what is our state of affairs currently, and you also elaborated on the relationship between our time now and this very important moment in Muslim history, the Battle of Badr. I have a few questions of my own, and there are some questions from the listeners, our participants. First of all, I want to ask the question that I think a lot of youth, especially Muslim youth, are thinking about, which is the inside-outside question. Now, you talked about building coalitions, and as we know, the in-group, or the group that we as Muslims consider to be our fellow travelers on the path to justice, are formed around certain beliefs. We call them in our tradition aqidah. Right. And practice, on the other hand, that means the actual practice of each of these individuals is seen as being not as important as the aqidah, the beliefs. What this does is, this causes a bit confusion, because it prevents us from creating coalitions around people whose practice, when you have to prioritize practice first. That means, listen, if we want to have a just society, we have to have people who practice justice. But as I've said, the commitment to justice comes secondary to aqidah. So there's a little bit of a tension between the way traditional Muslims have defined their in-group in terms of beliefs. So put this in a kind of, to make it more clear, is that if I see someone doing injustice, right, I turn a blind eye, right? Why? Because this person is the in-group. He's part of the member of the community. I tolerate it. I show patience, right? Because the practice is not as important as the beliefs that I share. How do we square this circle? How do we create coalitions when we are a community that defines ourselves around, principles of belief and not about justice? I mean, this is something that, we are, traditional Muslims are thought of. That's number one. Another question that came, I'm going to give you a couple of questions so you can speak in a relaxed manner. How should Muslim intellectuals and thought leaders deal with our fault lines? Right? Particularly sectarianism, secularism, nationalism, and the role of religion in society, and civil-military relations, to name a few. These fault lines, I think, are very important for us to think about. You mentioned them in your talk, but if you could elaborate a little bit more on how we can tear down these fault lines, or repair these fault lines. My third question, and then I'll hand it over to you, is the question of tolerance. Now, as we, people who study Islamic political thought, a lot of it revolves around the foundational ideas of someone like Ibn Khaldun, in which he talked about group asabiya, right? That a movement of political action starts with asabiya. That asabiya is usually around either some kind of tribal relationship or family or kinship. Now, tolerance requires us to have a more diffused understanding of asabiya. That means that, people who aren't in our tribe or in our close circle, that we bring them in the fold. But I feel like the idea of tolerance And the idea of asabiya as a prerequisite to political action, there's tension there, because how can we be tolerant on one hand and then also maintain the asabiya needed to be a strong force of in order to articulate a political will? These are three questions. You can speak on them one by one or as a whole, as you wish.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair. Thank you very, very much for very incisive, detailed, and difficult questions. I would say that these are thoughts in motion as opposed to completed thoughts. They're up for debate and they're up for contestation. I sound more certain than I am, but I think that we need necessarily to sound provocative if we are going to disrupt our current thinking, because our current thinking isn't bringing us anywhere. We had the Arab Spring, we had the counter-revolution. We had the golden era, we now beggars at the door of technology. We developed algorithms, we are now consumers of what we developed, rather than the upgraders of what we've developed. So the state of the Ummah is so bad that a good deal of provocation is unavoidable. So that's my disclaimer. On the issue of Aqidah, praxis, and relationships, let me remind you, and I won't go over the detail again, I gave 3 levels of relationships. 1, purely tactical, because we share issues. 1, strategic, because we share objectives. And the 3rd one, principled alliances, because we share values, aqidah, principle, or even elements of any of those things. So I don't have a one-shoe-fits-all approach to it. Every situation must be evaluated on its own merits, and every potential partner has to be evaluated on their own merits. But the fact of the matter is that the Prophet ﷺ was not choosy, in the sense that he reflected on the meeting that was held, in which the Khilful Fudul was formed. He did not say, he simply said, I was at that meeting, and today in Islam, if I were called upon, I would gladly do the same. I would gladly respond. Meaning that he ignored the fact that he was in the company of some of the arch polytheists, that he was in the house of the Quraysh who was going to oppress him later, that it was based on tribal commitments as opposed to simply commitments to justice. So the fact of the matter is that here is the Prophet ﷺ commending on one merchant who was wronged, rather than a whole landscape of injustice that needs to be sorted out. And so I would reformulate what you say about justice secondary to Aqidah. I think justice is integral to Aqidah. That we have been created for just purposes. We have been created equal. We have been created with khuriyah, with freedom. And anyone who denies any of those maqasid, intents that are in the DNA of a human being, is defying Aqidah itself. And in terms of who our fellow travelers could be on the road to justice, you see, I think there's a prior question to the formation of partnerships, coalitions, or alliances. It is whether those that you are engaging with, are they busy with sins or crimes? Because if people are busy with activities which we may regard as sinful, sin classically belongs in the domain of Allah and within the sovereignty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's between the sinner and the creator. On the other hand, a crime involves a third party. And therefore, a crime is not simply expiated. In much the same way, there's a process of judicial process that is required because a third party would have been wronged. So what I'm saying is that sometimes inadvertently and unconsciously, we appropriate the domain of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to pass judgment and then to withhold ourselves from participating in an overarching struggle in which we have common objectives, common issues, and maybe we share one or two values of equality and justice of people. So I would say that had we in South Africa persisted with making Aqidah the criterion between whether to work with others or not, we would have had a post-apartheid South Africa, but the place of Muslims would have been vulnerable, tenuous, and untrustworthy, because we would not have been able to prioritize the suffering of people immediately at the altar of what we hold up as our Aqidah. On the fault lines, I think, again, we are dealing with what I call the Dawla Islamiyah, the Islamic State, the Darul Islam, and trying to transport that and all its precepts into the new. But we have begun to see scholarship and thought and practice. Sheikh Rashid Al-Ghanouchi has been one of the major is the state of divorcing and creating distance between the state and religion. Secularism and secularist is an attack on religion. So if we can begin to become elegant in our language, we may free up our mind to pursue the very important values that we would be having. In much the same way, I have no problem with tradition. Tradition is the passover of values and lessons from one generation to the other, using ritual, using traditional, using song, using culture. Traditionalism is what Nabi Ibrahim ﷺ encountered in his father. It is the worship of tradition, to make it even higher than God itself. And so we must make these nuances, and therefore some of the moves are tactical. We're not saying that there can be a permanent alliance with the military. We made that mistake in Egypt, post-Arab Spring Egypt. We thought that they were reliable. Instead of, for example, looking for pockets within the military, schisms within the military, and weakening it from within. And so I would say that we've got to overcome the demon of sectarianism. If someone says La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah, I would be happy from a point of Aqidah. I may differ on the point of Ibadah. How are you praying there? What are you saying there? I would be dismayed when a subset of that would insult others, but the Prophet ﷺ did not even make love for himself and praising for him a precondition for admitting the humanity of someone else. The person who threw dirt at his door every day is the one that he found when she was ill. And yet we want to make that someone said this about this Sahaba, etc. We want to make that such a major fault line that we are allowing the Ummah to be weakened, to be split, and to be internally fighting as opposed to internally cohesive. And finally, tolerance. I think maybe 25 years ago, 30, 50 years ago, the likelihood of someone in a village, in a Muslim country, having ever seen a different person, a Chinese person, a white person, would have been remote. Hearing a different language, eating a different food would have been remote. Today, it's the condition of life. You see them on TV, you see them in reality, they are into your town, you go to their places, your children are living in those societies, etc., etc. And therefore, the old axis on which solidarities were formed, family and tribe and village, have given way to new solidarities that is no longer based on dressing like you, eating like you, praying like you, doing what you do. It's now based on shared values, shared objectives, shared issues. And therefore, I think that when we must reach out, we must understand it as such.
Thank you very much. I had another question because of your extensive experience in activism in South Africa and dealing with also post-government. As you know, today, post-ISIS, and also just a general state of failure in many Muslim nation states. Is the nation state still a part of the equation of justice? I mean, a commitment to national citizenship, to the nation state as a platform for practicing politics and justice. As you know, some people are very critical of Muslim movements that are committed to the nation state as a framework of justice. So this has led to, transnational networks of Muslim actors who are at one hand they're globalist in their vision, but at the same time they are also displaced. They don't have a home, they don't have commitments to a single place. So this is also a part of modern life. How do we pursue justice? I mean, is the nation, my main question is the nation state still part of the equation?
I think one of the greatest casualties of COVID-19 is going to be the nation state and the system of international governance. It's been found wanting. No country can hold sovereignty over its right to fight the disease in this way when it has an impact globally. And so terror, for example, viruses and diseases, and increasingly trade are showing us that borders have become so porous as to become almost irrelevant. And we've got to shift from a system of international government, the management of nations, to global governance, the management of the globe. Because that's the challenge of climate change. We have allowed a country or a few countries to spew carbons into the earth at the expense of the well-being. The person in Africa did nothing to emit carbons, and yet Lake Chad has disappeared, and with that, their livelihood. And therefore, we need to have a system of global governance for these transnational challenges, diseases, climate, terror, etc., etc., that we need to be able to manage. That does not mean that there aren't entities such as nations. And even South Africa, we're a nation with 11 languages, multiple tribes, a polyglot of languages, etc. So there is not blood holding us together, but an ideal and a history that shapes identity. And therefore, again, the Asabiya of old is giving way to more values-based, ideals-based, and exigency-based. The need to combat climate change, coronavirus, etc., etc. And therefore, I think that we are dealing with what is happening globally, and then sometimes what is happening at the micro level. Cities are competing with each other a lot more than nations. Cities are competing for trade and for goods more than nations are. Nations can set policies, but it's down at the ground that I think we need to manage things differently.
Thank you very much. I want to move a little bit closer to home for yourself. I mean, here at CIGA, we try to monitor, different regions of the world. And recently, Africa, the continent from which you're from, has had some major points of concern. There's two in particular that are of immediate concern. One is Libya. Libya has been bleeding in a civil war for over 9 years now, especially after the intervention of NATO, and also the Horn of Africa. I mean, in the first part of 2020, Americans have used airstrikes in Somalia more than they have in the last year or so. These are points of concern in terms of violence. So could you tell us something about both the issues in North Africa, especially Libya, and how we'll be able to solve these two problems?
I think that we have seen that where militarism was the default of any mediation, conflict resolution, and so forth, it has more often than not exacerbated and deepened the problem as opposed to solving the problem. I think that's not to say that there is no room for strategic use of force, of militarism, but it can't be the primary use, and it certainly can't be the first use, the first resort within that. And that's where I come back to my triangular conundrum, in which I say our primary task at the apex is to relieve the restless. That has to be the overriding objective. At the bottom left angle, it is to manage the unsustainable. And I use the word manage advisedly because the question is, should we have managed Gaddafi better? Should we have managed a transition? Should we have managed an abdication? And then on the third one, the bottom right angle, is the idea of isolating, defeating the undesirable. Because the truth of the matter is that Libya has now become the playground of the undesirable. And so has the Horn of Africa, and so has Iraq, and so was the case in Afghanistan. Wherever there was a vacuum, the undesirable flourished. Because the management of the unsustainable was militaristic, and the people who continue to suffer are the restless, the poverty-stricken masses. And so if you can manage that triangle and keep all three angles in mind all the time, then it takes you to the idea that Nelson Mandela stood for. He didn't see justice and peace as binaries. He did not even see them as preconditions, the one of the other. Because we have preconditions, first justice, then peace, and it's logical. But you know, a lesson I learned from the Jewish rabbis is that justice and peace are intersecting circles. If you strive for too perfect a justice, you will never have peace. Because there will always be reasons to fight for better justice. On the other hand, if you have too perfect a peace, you're probably papering over the injustice of your society through repression and other means. And therefore the question is often a question of proportion. You need enough justice in order for the restless to live. But you also need enough peace, sufficient peace, in order for you to continue to evolve your system of justice. Because how do you force a despot to fight to the death? And they start burning the oil underground, they start detonating nuclear weapons, their weapons go all over and inflame other areas, etc., etc. Whereas the prospect of it. So I would, answering your question in very simple terms, I think that the African Union has a very sustainable way, born out of long experience of pursuing it. In fact, the day when 5 African presidents were on their way to Gaddafi for the final persuasion to step down, they were told they couldn't fly because the US and NATO had imposed the no-fly zone. And the rest is history. In much the same way, the Somalian fragmentation should not have been allowed to happen because it doesn't stay in Somalia. It now terrorizes the ships at sea. And some of that expression is now in Mozambique, in the northern areas of Mozambique. And so I would say that your toolkit for peacemaking has to have all of the above and sequenced properly. And the first, maybe not the primary, but the first one has to be the art of persuasion, of diplomacy, of conflict resolution, of mediation. And we've got to withhold international players with bad agendas. Because some come for the oil, some come for hegemony, some come for this, some come under the disguise of protecting the vulnerable, etc., etc. So in a sense, I would say you've got a full toolkit, but you've got to sequence the tools in a particular way.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give you one last round and then we'll end because I know you have to leave a little early because of your busy schedule. Here are 2 questions that one is, I think, of a tactical or strategic nature. Should we have a global justice movement dealing with many issues, even competing ones such as poverty, discrimination, occupation, genocide? Or should we have different movements, a plurality of movements, each one based on their issue? How do we prioritize strategically and moving forward? As you have mentioned in your talk, there has been so many issues that the Ummah is facing, and humanity as a whole, especially after COVID. So how do we take the first step? What is the way forward, both in terms of practice and also vision? Yeah. So should we have multiple movements or a global movement now that the world is globalized? Second question for you is about global governance. So you said that the COVID crisis is showing the gaps in global governance, and global governance, a larger and stronger global governance architecture also may lead to a suppression of dissent, right, and disagreement. Nowadays, we've seen that countries are putting up tariffs, restricting travel, prioritizing domestic interests over international globalized interests. Was globalization and a strive for global government just was that the exception? And we are returning back to a kind of a more nation state localized reality? These are the two questions, and then we'll end.
Thank you very much, Uwais. On the first question on global justice, should it be a single global justice movement that encapsulates many issues or a plurality of issue-based movements? I think at the extremes, both would be wrong. They may be necessary, but they will not answer the piercing questions that we face. I think a global justice movement without the tactility of issues that is nebulous, etc., I think will not solve our problem for justice. At the same time, if there's no organizing principle amongst a plethora, a plurality of issue-based movements, you are also not going to have, you'll have impact at a local level, but not impact the global situation in which we find ourselves. I think the answer, as always, lies in the wasatiyah. It's in the middle ground somewhere. I think certainly you need to take up the issues as they affect people in different contexts. How do we deal with hunger in this country, the Palestinian occupation there, the exclusion by the banks over there, housing movements for the homeless, etc., climate movements in all its manifestations? I think you've got to have those kind of issues really being taken up, and local movements and national movements required for all of those things. Otherwise, the poor are simply the backdrop to your struggle. They are not the center of your struggle. The people who face injustice are simply your backdrop, not your center, not your objective. On the other hand, you're going to have coordination amongst all of these things. And we've had these jamborees, social justice movements, the forums that are held, etc. But its weakness has often been that it has not often given strategic guidance. It's been an exchange of tactics. It's been able to say, we tried this march here and it worked. We did pot banging over there. We did this. We are taking up this issue. And so we are transporting tactical examples across the world. But we are not collecting this into a global justice movement, coordinated, in touch with each other, exchanging tactics, exchanging strategies, holding up principles, alternative principles. And again, I think in holding up those alternative principles, we've got to respond to the conditions on the ground. Otherwise, our global justice movements will just be anti-neoliberal, pro-socialist, without giving it the kind of thing, what do people need there? Sometimes it's just farms. They want ownership of that farm, whereas we may be saying something different. And so I think there must be a creative tension, a dialectic between a global leadership and a local campaign. If you don't allow it to be dialectical and to influence each other, you will be fighting over old terminologies, old ideologies, rather than creating something that responds to the world as it is. And then the last question on global governance and so forth. I think that there are certain areas of life that require global governance. I've mentioned them: climate change, disease management, I think aspects of intelligence, so that we don't create a war somewhere else and open up a vacuum somewhere else, and all of these kind of things. So it's not every aspect, every policy area of life that must be controlled. I think contextual approaches are still required. You can't govern South Africa like you govern the US. You can't do in Turkey what you do in Mexico. There may be similarities. So I think, therefore, that I'm not advocating for the demise of the nation state. I'm advocating for nation states to abdicate some of their sovereignty, to give up some of their sovereignty when it comes to the key questions that answer the question of the future of humanity itself. So how do we share sovereignty in some cases? How do we abdicate sovereignty in other cases? And how do we retain sovereignty in other cases? Those really are and so what we will require is local governance. We may require areas of national competence. We then need some international governance where nations must negotiate with each other about certain things, and then there will be areas of global governance where you see some sovereignty as you move forward. I hope I've gotten to the heart of that last question of yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Rasul. Your time is very precious. We really appreciate you participating. Yes, your answers have been comprehensive. My questions were a little disjointed because I am also funneling what are questions of others online. So I'm trying to group them together in some kind of coherency, but I wanted to make sure that everybody has a voice who gave a question. In any case, these are conversations that we have to continue. These are issues that are very important, and I really appreciated the way that you laid out a kind of macro vision for how we can pursue justice, and also tying it to very appropriately Ramadan in our context in remembering the Battle of Badr. Hopefully, we have all benefited. I know that you have to go, so I will allow you to leave. Coming up, I want to say before we end the session that our next talk is tomorrow. It is, as you see the flyer, Rumi in the boardroom, reading yourself. For leading others. It's by Dr. Fuad Mimoni. It will be at 3:30 Istanbul time. I look forward to seeing all of you there. Thank you again, Ambassador Rasul.
Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.